Hey everyone, welcome back to LifePoint Students Online. We are actually in week 3. I know, right? Week 3 of a season in the minors. And today we're actually talking about Habakkuk. Now, repeat after me, Habakkuk, because if you've ever come across this while maybe going through the Bible or even taking the time to read it, pronunciation is interesting. So I think as long as we get it close to Habakkuk, I almost messed it up there too, or Habakkuk, depending on where you want to put the emphasis on the syllable. But anyway, so we're talking English today. Now, Habakkuk is one of the people we're focusing on, the minor prophets we're talking about. And again, if this is your first time joining us for this series, or any series for that matter, but we've been more just focusing on the minor prophets, shorter books of prophecy in the Old Testament, and we talked about what is a prophet, what is prophecy in the first lesson, and a little bit last week. And last week, as you recall, we talked about Haggai, and so today we're talking about Habakkuk, basically trying to get the hardest names out of the way. No, I'm just kidding. So as I said, talking about the Old Testament prophets, and today we're looking at Habakkuk. That's kind of the focus of today. Some quick facts, because we're just going to jump right in. Some quick facts about Habakkuk. He is a prophet at the same time as Jeremiah and Daniel. That puts us around 605 BC. Now, if you recall, last week Haggai was writing around 520 BC. So this is about 75 years before Haggai. And again, over these different generations, God uses these prophets to warn the people of Israel of their wicked ways of being unfaithful in their covenant with God. I don't want to get too far ahead because that's part of the lesson. But Habakkuk is, his whole writing, his whole book is basically a dialogue between himself and God. And so there's just a back and forth give and take to the conversation. Habakkuk does not actually include a specific message for Israel. And there's a good reason for that, because Habakkuk represents the overall feeling of many in Judah at the time of his response. And part of this communication that he has becomes basically a public expression as he shares this writing. Now, again, without getting too far off track and without taking a huge history lesson, Judah is still part of the nation of Israel, but in a sense kind of its own separate kingdom. At one point, under King David, the giant killer, the nation became one. And sometime after him, after some other kings, Solomon, and everything, the two kingdoms broke apart. Now, Israel was in the southern kingdom and Judah was in the northern kingdom. Now, the point of this is that those regions, while separate, were also the same but different. So it gets very confusing. And the point is that by Habakkuk writing, we know kind of where his region, where the people he was trying to reach. What kind of prophecy are we talking about? Well, it's a general kind of forth-telling prophecy, which is basically explaining things at the time, things that were just going on, and what was being written about it. Now, it becomes prophecy, and it becomes and Habakkuk is a minor prophet, because God is communicating to him, who ultimately brings a message of warning, a message of, it doesn't have to be just that, it could be hope if Israel turns from their ways, which they don't. But it's prophetic in that God is communicating through a person that he has chosen with this ability, with this gift, to share what he's saying. And sadly, Israel, for the most part, closes its ears. So basically, the book of Habakkuk is a conversation between God and Habakkuk. It shows what a conversation kind of could be for us, what it could be like if we took the time or had the presence of mind or the willingness to dive into the Word and know the Word intimately and be in a place where we just listen, because clearly Habakkuk takes the time to listen for God's response. Habakkuk truly shows us, really, and and personally, that if we are open with God about what we got going on in our heart and in our mind, that we might be more able to understand Him. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that, but it comes down to being authentic. Are we authentic with God? The book of Habakkuk is really the prophet, Habakkuk, respectfully questioning God or even complaining to Him. He wonders, what is God doing in all of this that's going on? Yeah, Israel's being evil and so on and so forth, but what are you doing about it? In the back and forth discussion, God offers a prophetic view, as I said, of what He has done, is doing, and is going to do. So that's kind of where we enter the conversation with God and Habakkuk. So Habakkuk, his first complaint is just coming right out and saying to God, this is where I struggle, this is my confusion, this is my frustration. Habakkuk basically tells God in chapter 1 that things are basically kind of horrible down here. And I, Habakkuk, try to talk to you, God. I try to talk with you about it, and you do nothing. I just come to you, and I come to you, and I feel like, you're not speaking to me. Which is kind of ironic because God eventually speaks to him. But everyone gets mad at God. Again, I can't stress that enough. And I think it's important for us to recognize that. At some point, for some people it's a small thing that really makes them angry. For some people it takes a huge situation. But most of us, if we're honest, do get angry or frustrated with God at times. Now, if we're, like I said, if we admit that, if we can go to Him and even admit that, we're mad, But I think God is able to handle us being mad or confused. It's not that He just shuts us off and goes, I can't deal with this right now. And I think that kind of really sparks His bond with God, His ability to hear God, because He is authentic. He unpacks His emotion to God and just says, here's what's going on. And it doesn't frighten God away. God doesn't get frightened by that stuff. He embraces that because that's real, honest communication. And again, as I said, God is able to handle that, our anger, our confusion over a situation. But rather than admit it sometimes, we use it to stumble over. We use it as a situation where we get angry and then we stop talking with God. And then we wonder why He doesn't communicate or He doesn't guide us anymore. And yet, then we blame God more for even more things that happen. So we stumble over this situation, and rather than addressing it head on and drawing closer to God, we use it as a way to withdraw from Him. So God's response to this, hey, you're not doing anything, is, and this is still chapter 1, I'm not doing nothing. The evil you speak of will be made right, and I will use the Babylonians to do it. So I have a solution. It's coming, and it's going to come into the form of the Babylonian army. And if you might remember some of your history, at this point, the Babylonian army is very large and dangerous, kind of like a superpower. But so Habakkuk's response to God, again, this is a back and forth. God says, I will handle it, trust me. I'm going to use the Babylonians. So Habakkuk feels, in response to that, his other complaint, that God's response isn't fair. Why does the bad guy, in this case the Babylonians, why does the bad guy always get rewarded and the good guy gets left with nothing? Now, of course, that's not really a fair assessment because Israel's not really the good guy here. They have been unfaithful for generations. They have entered into practicing more pagan ways like all the other nations around them. They've really embraced that, and really the crux of everything is they have, again, been unfaithful with their covenant with God. But it's fair also to say that the Babylonians were way worse still. So, in a way, Habakkuk makes a point. And this is kind of what the whole thing is. Doesn't it feel like sometimes the way of the world is that, nothing ever works out for the good guy, good never gets what's really coming to them in the end, and the bad guys do. Like they get to seem to win. But this is where God responds. God's second response to this idea that Habakkuk throws out there, like, hey, the good guys always lose. and the bad guys always win. And again, God doesn't agree with that. He says, I am a just God, and justice will be served on my timeline. And they, the Babylonians, will get what's coming to them. They'll get theirs ultimately, but not before I use them for my purpose. They deserve justice, but so does Israel. So calm down and trust me, Habakkuk. Calm down. Take the time to really see that I have things planned out, and that we just got to get to the time and space where this takes place. So, in chapter 3, we see Habakkuk's response to God reminding him that he is just. Now, I don't want to get too far into the Babylonian situation. We're going to discuss it here, but this is where kind of Habakkuk takes a little bit of a turn. We have this back and forth conversation, and basically we find that Habakkuk unburdens himself. Again, it's kind of speaking for the people in a way. And it is here that we really find for even ourselves, much like Habakkuk did, what we should learn from this whole book, this whole minor prophet. First of all, Habakkuk remembers how God has acted before, in both good and just ways. So he kind of takes stock of how God has moved in the past. Secondly, he knows God will follow through. If nothing else, God will follow through, maybe in his own time, but he will always stay true to his word. Again, that's where the kind of the prophecy, the prophetic part of this book is, that we know, because we have the benefit of reading through, that God has moved when he is needed to move, how he's needed to move. And Habakkuk also takes stock of that. In chapter kind of towards 2, God's plan may feel like it lingers. He talks about how this God's saying he's going to do these things, and it lingers. It feels like it's going to happen, but when? But also this is where we talk about we must learn patience and wait for it. And patience, it doesn't always kind of equate or equal faithfulness, but when you have the two together, it seems to work very well. They're not the same, patience and faithfulness. But if you can have both, right, they strengthen one another. Patience leads to more faithfulness. Faithfulness lets our patience grow. So Habakkuk also, in all of this, looks to himself, not only his enemies. He kind of remembers that, he has a part in all of this, much like we do in whatever circumstance that we find ourselves. Maybe we're more central to our situation that's rough, or maybe we're just on the kind of outskirts, but we're still affected by it. The point is that we are in there somewhere, and so is Habakkuk in all this. Chapter 3, kind of come to this point where Habakkuk, in God's wrath and in the need for wrath, or who gets God's wrath, Habakkuk remembers mercy. Because, to be honest, again, with all these generations of Israel's unfaithfulness, they still have been recipients of great mercy, even in patience on God's part. Because, again, for a while now, decades, maybe even, God has been using these prophets to warn Israel, turn from your ways, turn from your ways. If you don't, bad things will come. Punishment, discipline will come. And they still don't listen, but still, God could have just been no warning, boom, judgment, discipline, right? Punishment. But no, they even still are recipients of mercy. And he recognizes that while the Babylonians might be used today, they will receive their punishment soon enough, and it won't be as lenient, because again, they were a much more pagan society. So, and more than anything, I think we should remember God is very upset with Israel being unfaithful, like I said, for generations. And his wrath and judgment is, more than anything right at this point, is for Israel's unfaithfulness. I think we need to point that out more than anything. So while Habakkuk is upset and complaining, and we understand his point to an extent, it would not be proper to say that, Israel is not deserving of this. Habakkuk, like all prophets, warned the people of their wickedness. Okay, he's used to this. But God has had enough, so he will bring a huge army, in this case, the Babylonians. And this is why Habakkuk is upset. I think more kind of like Jonah, Habakkuk, in his complaint, doesn't like that Babylon gets to be the punishment, or the one who brings about punishment on Israel. Like, who are they to judge us, right? They are, again, just as evil or worse, probably more fair to say worse. But the point is, I think one of the things Habakkuk doesn't like is that it's Babylon. Now, I don't know who he would have picked, if anybody. Like, can't Israel clean up its own problems? Well, they've had that opportunity. So God says, I can use whomever I want to do this. Okay? So, again, this is why Habakkuk complains. And remember, God says, I'm the ultimate place of judgment here. I'm the one who brings about judgment. And it will come soon enough, especially for Babylon. So, yeah, I might be punishing Israel for this. But even other prophecy tells that no matter what kind of punishment God brings about, he will always leave a remnant to reestablish and rebuild. So this might be a pruning, it might be a discipline. Yeah, that's rough. But whatever's coming to Babylon, when they've been used for his purpose, is going to be far worse. So that's why in chapter 3, Habakkuk remembers that God's wrath is real. Very real and very decisive. Yeah, for Israel, and they'll suffer. Well, we read that throughout the rest of the Old Testament. They do suffer, but they come back. But Babylon will not last God's judgment, and they're not meant to. So in all of this, Habakkuk remembers mercy. He has been a recipient of mercy. So while he doesn't necessarily pray that upon the Babylonians, he remembers that God's wrath is not something that you wish upon anything or anyone. So that kind of leads to this idea in Habakkuk chapter 3, where he responds, he basically enters into worship. He says to himself, to Israel, and even to us, that the righteous should live by faith. And in the rest of chapter 3, turns into kind of a worship song or poem. So in all of this discussion, in the end, Habakkuk, with reverence through it all, says, God has responded to me. I need to take the time to recognize his place in all of this. And so that he instantly just goes into worship, goes into a poem of just sharing more of what God has meant to him in all of this. So I think a couple things that I'd like trying to close out with. When you don't know the answer, or you are questioning something going on, probably many things, in any situation, basically big or small, we need to remember the past. How has God moved for you specifically? Or how has he come through before? Really take stock and really be honest with yourself, because even some things that might seem small, just because you think they happen that way, may actually have been a huge blessing from God that we just kind of left, and just thought, oh, well, that's just how things work out. No, not necessarily. Look at what you know about God and his character, right? If we claim to be in Christ and become a Christ follower, let's really take stock of what he has shown us about his character, and not put ourselves, our own character, into God, right? If you read the word sometimes, maybe you read Jesus in the way that you would respond to something, and we kind of make Jesus say with our attitude, but it doesn't work like that. Let's be honest with ourselves, honest with God. And again, look at yourself, not the situation, right? Again, some of these situations that we deal with are so huge that we may not be in the center of it, or something we can't completely control at all. But yet we do have a place somewhere in that circumstance. So what is it about yourself in all of this? How can you respond better? How can we draw closer to God rather than withdraw away from? Fourth, respond based on these truths. Truths, not feelings, right? Let's embrace these things. Let's deal with these things with truth and with our faith. And that's where I think we'll draw true strength, much like Habakkuk. Lastly, it is fair to say that life on earth doesn't always make sense, rarely makes sense. And for those brief times, I think that it does, enjoy them and be content with them, because there's other things that are going to kind of rock the boat. But ultimately, no matter what, God is truth, and He is in control. I do pray that this has been a blessed and wonderful day for you. I hope that this message has brought you encouragement. And if nothing else, like, it's challenged you to maybe find some peace or find some hope in God's Word today. And with that, I pray that you have a wonderful and blessed day, and we'll talk to you later. Bye.